Hey there, kids. Today we're going to talk about the wonderful, respectable land of Africa and how its insanely high levels of corruption are breaking the backs and spirits of its people. Africa is home to arguably the most corrupt countries in the entire world. This corruption is mainly in relation to safety officers and public service systems. It was reported in 2015 that an average of 22% of the African population was forced to pay a bribe to public services. The situation was worse in Liberia, where an estimated 70% of the people were forced to pay bribes at some point. That's about 3.7 million human beings. Bribes are so prevalent that they've just become a normal way of life for the majority of the African population. It's silly how many things that the African people have to pay bribes for, and how awful the consequences can be. For instance, the OJP reported that over half of Africans agree that all of their police are corrupt. Africans routinely get beaten or imprisoned. Routinely. Africans report having to pay bribes for their utilities, the things like water, plumbing, and everything we consider to be small conveniences here in the US. You might be wondering if it can get worse than that. And it can! And it is! People are also forced to bribe their educators and those in charge of schooling them. Imagine your final grade being dependent on how much you can make it worth the teacher's while. And last, and possibly the worst, they have to bribe for medical treatment and health centers. All this open violation of human decency has led to very widespread distrust of the government and public services. You know, because they're just thieves in suits. Some sources say that 83% of Africans agree that their government is completely failing to address the corruption in their countries. Which makes sense, because the government is where the corruption is stemming from. If you think about it, the channels that they would go through to report these things lead directly to those profiting from their suffering, which only leads to consequences for them. The governments of Africa generally have the same policy when it comes to morale, and that is to viciously beat the people until morale improves. They have yet to see this actually have a good effect upon their people. However, results have not come back conclusive yet, and they intend to continue attempting to find them. An article from Transparency.org says that 2/3 of Africans fear that they'll be jailed if they report any corruption, which is with good reason, as they will be jailed, or worse, for reporting said corruption. There are many examples of this, but here are just two that I thought were particularly bad. In Niger, journalist and blogger Samira Sabu was convicted in January 2022 of defamation by electronic communication. She was forced to pay a $100 fine and was sentenced to a month in prison. This verdict, however, was come to only after she posted an article talking about the Nigerian Traffic Agency. This agency is responsible for stopping the flow of drugs into their country and within their country. The agency was clearly found reintroducing confiscated narcotics back into the black market. But in their defense, those drugs were made to be sold and were just going to sit in the fridge until they went bad. Next up, we have a particularly horrific case that happened in Cameroon. Martinez Zogo, a journalist and head of a privately owned radio station, in 2023 he was abducted by unidentified men. His mutilated body was found in a wasteland in the suburbs of Yaoundé, Cameroon's capital, on January 22nd. Zogo had been investigating and reporting on the embezzlement of hundreds of billions of CFA francs by politicians and businessmen close to the government. And if that wasn't enough, in the same week, a human rights attorney working on the same case was gunned down in Eswatini. These are just two of many similar stories. In 2022, close to 60 journalists in Africa were assaulted, imprisoned, abducted, or forced into exile. This has clearly repressed any public opposition of the government. This is all very important to note, because if it can happen in Africa, it can happen where we are too. We need to actively voice the issues in our society as they come up, because if they're swept under the rug for too long, our issues can be made as a main part of our whole system as a society. If this continues to happen in Africa, it will only get worse. Corruption only brings more corruption. And since in their own countries, the Africans are forced to not speak out against their issues with extreme force, it's up to those of us on the outside to tell of the horrible violations that happen there. Maybe if we can bring these things to light, we can break the cycle of fear and abuse of power that is core to part of many African governments. This means a lot to me, because I, unlike most people, think that the suffering of millions of people isn't exactly cool. And with so many people's rights being violated, it should be important to you as well.